Welcome to the Yale Center for British Art's online series, At Home, Artists in Conversation. I'm Scott Wilcox, Senior Research Scholar at the Center, and I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Rose to our program today. Also with us is Tom Eccles, Executive Director of the Center for Curatorial Studies and Hessel Museum of Art at Bard College and Curator at Park Avenue Armory. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Rachel and Tom, and they will be answered at the end of the program. My colleague, Molly Dotson, Assistant Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Center, will join us at the end to pose your questions. Rachel Rose is a visual artist living and working in New York, known for her video installations. Her work explores how our changing relationship to landscape has shaped storytelling and belief systems. She draws from and contributes to a long history of cinematic innovation, and through her subjects, whether investigating cryogenics, the American Revolutionary War, modernist architecture, or the sensory experience of walking in outer space, she questions what it is that makes us human and the ways we seek to alter and escape that designation. Among her recent projects are Enclosure, jointly commissioned by the Park Avenue Armory in New York and the Luma Foundation in Arles, where it was shown in 2019, and Willow Wisp, commissioned by the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2018. Her work has been exhibited widely throughout the world with, most recently, solo exhibitions in Kassel in 2019 and at Pond Society in Shanghai and Lafayette Anticipations in Paris in 2020. She is the recipient of the Future Fields Award and the Frieze Artist Award. Tom Eccles has been the executive director of the Center for Curatorial Studies since 2005 and is the founding director of the Hessel Museum of Art at Bard College. He is the visual arts curator at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City, where he initiated the program in 2009. Tom, you've had a pretty interesting and impressive career, which I'd love to explore with you if we had more time, but as our time is limited, we'll be focusing today on Rachel. And rather than ranging over her whole body of award-winning work, I'd like to focus on two recent projects that have a specifically British connection, Willow Wisp from 2018 and Enclosure from 2019. Enclosure's presentation at the Park Avenue Armory was derailed by the pandemic. So my first question is about its future presentation. When will we be able to see it?
Well, I'm very much hoping that we'll be able to install the work early next year. Obviously, like any organization, you've had to shift your program and pull projects forward. So our aim with Rachel is in 2022. We'll have a date shortly, probably, hopefully the summer or early fall next year.
Great. We look forward to it. Rachel, to start off, you got your BA from Yale in 2009. Tell our audience about your connection with the Yale Center for British Art as an undergraduate.
Yeah, it actually started with taking a class on agrarian social history of early modern England with Keith Wrightson, the social historian who teaches at Yale. I think I came across this class, just a friend who was a history major had recommended it to me. And from there, it started an interest for me in visual culture from England and specifically depicting changes in the landscape. And so I became a tour guide at the Yale Center for British Art, and I gave a tour on Constable's landscapes. And then when I was at Yale, I was a double major in humanities and visual art. And within humanities, I focused on architecture and landscape history. And I wrote my thesis on Regent's Park and the development of Regent's Park. And so I actually ended up coming back to the Yale Center for British Art for some primary sources showing Regent's Park and the changes in London around the development there.
That wonderful little scroll panorama of
Exactly. I wonder if, anyway, I worked with that panorama, exactly. That shows the whole, trajectory.
That's great. Now, you went on to get an MFA from Columbia, starting the program as a painting student, but coming out of it as a video artist. Can you speak a little about how and why that change happened?
Yeah. So when I was at Yale, I studied painting with Robert Reed. I think taught at Yale for over 40 years and a legend and an exceptional mentor to so many artists for so long. I thought maybe I would be a painter because that's what I knew and that's what I was doing. And when I got to Columbia, I felt maybe I was in a kind of existential crisis. What's the purpose of art? Where can art live? Why do art? I asked myself questions that when I was younger, just a few years younger in college, maybe I didn't necessarily have to ask because I was just learning the practice or learning about visuality in general and visual literacy. And so, when I came to ask myself, okay, are you going to devote your life to this? What does it really mean to do this? I felt for me that the existential questions I had, I didn't know how to ask through painting. And it's like the tools didn't connect with what was inside me. And so at first I thought that meant I couldn't be an artist because I didn't naively understand that artists can make their own problems. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to be a filmmaker. But while I'm here at Columbia, I might as well learn how to be a filmmaker. So I started alongside another artist, Ronnie Bass, who taught me how to edit and do sound design, teaching myself how to film and edit and do the whole thing. And I set out to make a work which became my first video work called Sitting, Feeding, Sleeping. And when I finished the work, which I very explicitly thought was going to be a documentary film, it was clear that it was not a documentary film at all, that it was something else. And that something else was art. And so that's sort of how I shifted from a painter into what I do now.
Tom, when did you first become aware of Rachel's work, and how did the commission for Enclosure come about?
Yeah, our graduate students, they organize exhibitions, and our faculty is very much engaged in, curatorial projects throughout the world. One curator called Rubric Contrib had brought Rachel's work to my attention, and at the same moment, a graduate student for their exhibition wanted to show A Minute Ago, an early film installation by Rachel, which also, relates in some ways to what Rachel was saying about this interest in landscape. It's set between sort of two moments, one with Philip Johnson, a sort of avatar of Philip Johnson in the glass house giving a tour, then suddenly flashing to a sort of Italian landscape painting, to then this kind of moment of crisis where people sitting out nicely on a Siberian beach suddenly are kind of inundated by hailstorms and kind of run for cover, saying, I don't know if we're going to live. And it's the most dramatic, most beautifully kind of compiled work that sets up this relationship between our kind of projections on the landscape and the realities of a kind of ecological disaster. Or what do we do when nature does something dramatic to us? Like what are our expectations of the natural world? And what's our relationship to landscape? So we acquired that work for our museum, and then Rachel and I did a project, a public project in New York. And then for the Armory, we had been working with a number of very, very established artists. So we wanted to commission artists at a moment of transformation with their work, and also where we can use the resources of commissioning to help an artist actually transform the possibilities of the work.
We have on the screen a still from Enclosure. I think we should actually see a little bit of it, a clip. Rachel, could you set up this clip for us? What are we about to see?
Well, it takes place in sort of end 16th century, 17th century England. And it's about a moment in time in which landscapes or big swaths of land that were previously common, or people sort of lived without necessarily, people lived on common land. This land was being broken up and privatized. And as such, there were, we imagined, a set of grifters, hustlers, moving through the landscape who would trick people into selling their land and disenfranchise them. And it created a kind of mini refugee crisis in England during this time. And so this woman that you see, the main character, Reeson, she is the main actor within a group of hustlers called the Family, led by a guy named Jacko, who predate, as in stalk a family, look at them, see what they're up to, get to know them, and then a few days later go in, manipulate them, take their deeds, accrue all of those deeds, and do something with them. And in the case of our family of grifters, the leader's plan is to go to the New World, to go to America. So the scene that you're seeing here is this main character who's watching the family to understand their movements. And while she does that, someone comes out of the forest and alarms her. So it's looking at that.
Okay.
What are we looking at? You see, the nobles have begun clearing the woods, and this brings out bears who need to eat. And one female bear became obsessed with killing me. One day, when I saw her scratching at a tree, I fired a poison arrow at her heart, but she didn't go down. Sheltered beneath her was a cup, dead, blackened in ash from some hellish fire. A man-made flame, no doubt, and she carried that burned corpse around with her everywhere. How is it, did you think I lost my only child? This is not infringement. Would you not, too, hunt the god that killed your child for no reason?
Do not be deceived, my dear. No paper of blue can derail our ascension. Do you see? In there, in the core, in that sound, can you hear?
Sheltered beneath
In the black,
was a cup,
can you see? In the light of the stars,
dead,
core, Saturn, core, Mercury, core, Jupiter, in your
a man-made flame, no doubt.
the light,
Would you not, too, hunt the god that
voice,
killed
the
your
dry,
child
the
for no
color
reason?
of that, and you are here.
This is not infringement.
Now, we'll see, my dear.
One of the things that strikes me about enclosure is that it's beautiful in the way that traditional British landscape painting shows the beautiful British countryside, but it also shows a dark side of nature due both to human intervention and to natural processes of death and decay. Was that important to you in choosing this subject and exploring it in this way?
Totally. Actually, one of the things about shooting the film is that it in no way looked like the British landscape. I shot it in upstate New York, which has this very, in the middle of the summer. So the light is so harsh and bright. It has none of that kind of gray filtration and softness that you feel in the British landscape. And the color of the grass in New York is so much like a darker green than you find in England, where it has that kind of verdant, almost electric, mossy green. And so I was trying to come up with ways to shift the landscape after I shot it. And one of the ways I ended up doing that was changing the skies to feel more like England. So most of the skies that you see are artificial. They've been replaced. And one of the things that did is it helped suddenly shift it into a British landscape and not an upstate New York landscape. But it also, for me, was about occupying the perspective of someone who lived in the landscape then. This idea of the great chain of being, that everything is connected in a hierarchy and then it's stratified and there's category, and that angels and a worm are connected through this thread is so related to how people perceive the sky and orientated themselves in relationship to it, always looking up to it, it being the guide of the harvest, as we like see in some of the works that we'll look at later, like Samuel Palmer's Harvest Moon. Anyway, so many examples of this where the sky is the central guiding force. And so
the chief organ of sentiment, as John Constable said.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love that. Yeah. So I was thinking about that and really connecting it to, like, as you saw that shot of the worms, or this, like, what's happening in the forest at night, or even just the sort of banality of the forest or the trees around the stranger that you see. So kind of, I was interested in creating these two ends of the spectrum in terms of nature, something sublime in the sky and something very everyday in the land.
Yeah, in terms of speaking about the sky, I want to jump forward to something that we were going to talk about in a minute. And that is something that you don't see in the clip we just showed, but it's very much a presence in the film, which is this kind of dark orb, this kind of sinister orb that floats in the sky. And I did want to ask about that because it's such a presence in the film.
Yeah, I mean, this was an extension of what I was just describing about really celestial life being an actual force in people's lives. One thing I was trying to do, I mean, so often people especially anthropomorphize the sky and also project their feelings or romanticize their relationship to it. And so I wanted there to be this force that was looming, that was building with the tension of Recent, that main character that you saw, her hero's journey in the film story. And so the orb gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the film progresses. And yeah, I was thinking about it maybe as an eclipse, like the whole film is taking place during some form of an eclipse. Yeah, a way to visualize like a kind of mystery, but also a guiding force that existed in the sky then.
Yeah, I mean, it put me in mind of this particular image by William Blake, but there are a number of stylized images of the sun and the moon in the works of Blake and in the works of Samuel Palmer, which you referred to a minute ago. Yeah, let's go back. This is a still from Willow Wisp, and enclosure is, I guess, in some senses, an outgrowth, or at least it shares a similar setting and set of concerns with your earlier video piece, Willow Wisp. Can you tell us something about the genesis of that work and how the one came out of the other?
Yeah, well, I should zoom out for a second and just say that my interest in this period, in this landscape, really is to do with our present. In all of my works, I'm looking at roots of capitalism and how they affect our relationship to the landscape and our sense of our bodies and mortality today. And this question about roots of capitalism has often, by many people, been traced back to what was happening in the landscape in England during this time, the enclosure movement. And so I first became interested in it as a way of thinking about the beginning of the kind of environmental catastrophe and issues to do with global warming we're living with now. Where did those originate? They originated in an agricultural revolution, which led to an industrial revolution, which led to carbon emissions in our lives today. And what was the pretext for agricultural revolution? It was the enclosure movement. So that's how I got to this spot in time. And then when I arrived there, it was so rich because it was also this moment in which people's thinking around magic was shifting. Paganism, meanwhile, over just nearby in the cities, you have the Enlightenment happening. So it's such a a wild moment that in some ways feels deeply parallel to the moment that we live in now. So that's just a larger way to say, like, the reason I live in this moment in both of these works for so many years is because I'm actually living in our present, and it's a place to think about that. So in Willow Wisp, I was thinking about the breaking up of this landscape and its effect specifically on people's magical thinking. When did how we think about magic change? When did it get dispersed? When did science and medicine and rationalization come and take over? And really the holders of magic in communities were the alchemists, of course, who were often men, and then women who were the healers. And in many of these forest communities, really the political leaders and the guides of the whole world. And so I wrote this story about a invented woman named Elspeth, and it tracks her life over 30 years and looks at her role basically as a magician, and then her demotion into what then gets turned a witch, and turned a witch, and then from there her death. And so sort of been looking at this little portrait of a fantasy about this woman. It was a way of looking at this shift in magic in relationship to the landscape.
And it's interesting. She's such a strong character, not totally unlike the character of Recent in Enclosure. This kind of, there's the same sense of an inner strength, but also a kind of wariness. This is a collage of research materials for Enclosure. I see there's a Rite of Derby, a John Constable, a Thomas Gainsborough, a lot of other things. Is this representative of your working method? I mean, gathering all these images? You must have done a tremendous amount of research.
Yeah, this was included. This is a collage of research materials that was included in the book that we produced for the exhibition of Enclosure at Luma Arles in 2019. Yes, tons of research materials always in what I'm doing. And so much of this is important, especially in a project like Enclosure, where I had the opportunity to work with so many different skilled people to communicate what I'm thinking for a shot or how we might want to do a costume. It's just important to have everything.
Will there be a comparable publication accompanying the showing at the Armory?
Yeah, I've been working with Andrew Roth and Neville Wakefield. Andrew Roth has a publishing company to develop an artist book that will include the script and tons of materials and notes, and also a series of engravings that I've produced with Greg Burnett, a kind of master engraver here in New York.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we've got an image of one of those coming up at the end. So we have one more clip from the end of the video, and I have a spoiler warning. If you don't want to see how the film ends, look away. But otherwise, Rachel, do you want to say anything to introduce this last excerpt?
It's the very end of the film. And you see in this clip, Jacko, the person I referred to before, is the kind of figurehead leader that Recent works for, basically. And he's an alchemist. So in this, you'll see all his little tinctures. She kills him in the shot. What you see in this frame is the encampment where this family of hustlers lives. And they've just actually hustled and won the deed of the family that you saw her scoping out before. So that's the beginning. This is the very end. And she's thinking about what she's going to do with her life now that they've completed their task.
Venga. I'm fine, boy. Reason will take care of me.
You did fine today, Recent. Very fine. That tale was a thing of beauty. What wit. You nearly lured me into your bubble.
Thank you.
Recent. St. Augustine is not in Finchland. It never was in Finland. The deeds are not for a crest, but to exchange for a charter.
The New World.
I knew you'd see it was necessary. Reese, the New World is nothing but luscious green, waiting to be taken and cleared and claimed. And we can build there. Build. Recall here during the Crusades how the knights sought to purge the woods of bears. They sought to destroy the bear as a symbol. Where are bears now? The bear has never known his shame, his fear, his curse. History turns. Who, I wonder, do they think history shall come for next?
So I should say for our audience who hasn't seen the film yet, it's about a half hour in length, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tom and Rachel, tell us about the installation that you've developed for the Armory, how this film fits into that.
So there are two very different types of organizations. One is the Luma Foundation in Arles, in the south of France, which is very interested in production, working with an artist, taking a project wherever it goes, experimenting. So part of our experimentation with the project was to try to make this film with an element of 3D. But the 3D element, particularly the moon, as you've spoken about, could be viewed from a mountain. So we made this, so Rachel developed this kind of incredibly beautiful mountain that you kind of climbed up. And it was very particular to the fact that only a limited number of people could experience the film in that way, because only so many people could get on the mountain. So you kind of experience the landscape as though you're watching it from a hillside. At the Armory, we thought, let's not do that. Let's try to take this a stage further. But what would that be? What's the way into this film? What was interesting for us was to, consider the experience that the visitor had in Arles, to then realizing that we probably wanted some way to introduce the elements of the film itself prior to you seeing the film, and also to introduce a different form of looking. And we had no idea how we were going to do this. And I don't want to write myself into the history here, I may be doing so falsely, but I think I sort of popped into the National Gallery in London, and there was a Constable painting, I think, because I sent it to Rachel. Rachel said, oh, you know what, this could actually be our way in. And then I had no idea that she'd worked at the Yale Centre for British Art. And she said, well, I used to work at the Yale Centre for British Art. They've got an incredible collection. So we made a road trip, came to Yale Centre for British Art. And, normally when one does such a visit and then comes up with a kind of idea for how one might borrow quite a large number of works, very, very incredible, important works, Gainsborough, Constable, you have the incredible Samuel Palmer, which we have talked about already. Most institutions say, there's absolutely no way we're going to lend these works to you. But Yale was quite the opposite. And we were very excited by this fact of, in a way, slowly, you introduce Willow the Wisp, you come to then view a series of works in a kind of procession that then leads you to the film. And that also, for us with the Armory, was a quite remarkably new form of presentation. Never before, previous to this, in our commissions, which have been to a large degree very spectacular and very grandiose in some ways. And what Rachel was aiming at was something more intimate, something slower perhaps. And the paintings gave that foil to literally slow people down and to look in a particular way, which allows you to look at the film, which is quite complex, detailed, and demands your attention, while still being very beautiful and kind of in some ways mesmerizing.
Well, at the British Art Center, we're incredibly pleased, delighted to be part of this project, and hope to be when it's revived next year. These are actually two of the works that will be included in that display, Constable and our wonderful Palmer oil of the Harvest Moon. It's a white orb rather than a black one, but the kind of intensity of Palmer's vision of the landscape, I think, does work very well with the intensity of enclosure. From the two clips we've shown, I think the audience can get a sense of the accomplished filmmaking and the sort of closeness to movie making as we know it from feature films. They're beautifully acted, they're fully scripted and so forth. Rachel, do you have plans to move on into longer narrative films?
Yeah, I'm working on a script right now, actually, and kind of sci-fi film. So yes, I do, alongside making art. So my works are stories. They're all narratives. Since the first work I made, Sitting, Feeding, Sleeping, and the work that I met Tom through a minute ago, to Enclosure, they're all stories. And so expanding how to make a story is of deep interest to me.
But this, in terms of more kind of traditional works of flat art, this is one of the prints that you referred to that you've done for the publication or with the publication in mind. And I see that you've got, amongst a variety of quotations, you've got two figures that you are quoting from Samuel Palmer, the kind of striding man and the kind of curving female figure.
Yeah, so these are works. I actually started this type of image making when I was asked to do an edition for the Serpentine when I had an exhibition there in 2016. And what I did for their edition was I culled different lines from different artists over a kind of 500-year time span and linked those lines together. So it felt like this is an extension of that same practice. So for these engravings, I've taken, like you see, the Samuel Palmer and this guy, that's a Disney cell drawing. So a whole expanse of works from 16th century until the present, linking them together in this kind of story. The way that they're made, just to say, is they're first collaged together, and then I take them and I put them on an iPad, and there's a drawing tool on the iPad that's like drawing on paper, and I have a surface that feels like paper. And so then I work on them and I kind of redraw all the lines. And then those were made into copper plates with Greg, and then we engrave them and then print them.
Tom, maybe we could, before Molly comes in with her questions, maybe we could close with you setting the context for Enclosure in the broader Armory program. What do we have to look forward to once it's back up and running?
I think the last few years, we worked with Rachel, with Hito Style, and with others, really trying to commission new work, trying to, I think, more political work in some ways, not necessarily obviously political. And Rachel's work, I think, is profoundly political in our time, a time of conspiracies, of fake news, of Bitcoin, of people being disenfranchised, of social movements that are changing the landscape, our relationship to the ecology, of course, and the disasters that we face ahead. So to commission new works by this quote unquote younger artists, I think will be very important in the future. And also, I think, artists are looking for new modes of distribution of their work. They're not just artists anymore. So Rachel, in a way, was a kind of foregrounds this, where she's working as a fine artist, but also thinking about film, thinking about how art can be distributed. And I think that will be more important to us over the next coming years.
Great. Well, Molly, do you have any questions for us?
We do have a few questions in the Q&A feature, and I would invite others who haven't yet submitted theirs to please do so. We'll try to answer, get through as many as we can in the time remaining. But to start, we have a question here about the music or the soundtrack in Enclosure, and a question: how was this recorded, and how did you decide on some of the unusual sound effects?
Okay, so I want to say like two separate things about the sound, which was like a total joy in all directions in making this. So on set, it was just recorded live. And I worked with Isaac Jones to compose, we didn't show a clip of it, but some music of the time and the period that we actually had a musician come and play, actually from Yale School of Music. And he brought, and I'm forgetting the name of the instrument, an instrument from the 16th century that he knows how to play, that he played, and they composed music for on set. So that was magical. And also recording this kind of folk song that the people sing. And so we recorded some of the sound on set. And we also, I just want to say, had a really amazing person who was in charge of recording the actor's sound. And every day at the end of the shoot, sometimes that was at 5 p.m., sometimes that was at 3 a.m., depending on our schedule, he would call room tone, which is something they do on set, where the sound person takes about a minute of just sound with no one talking, so they can then isolate the speaker sound. And because we were shooting this out in nature and sometimes, at 3 a.m. in the dark, whenever he called tone, we would all have to freeze where we were, almost like one of those games you play when you're a kid where you're like, freeze, and be silent together for, sometimes up to like 3 minutes. And it was like this just magic. I don't even have the words for it. It was so cool to be with a group of like 30 people and you're all doing something and you stop and you're silent and you just listen to the frogs and the wind in the trees. And so that was just a cool thing about the sound on set. But in terms of the composition of the music, I worked with a kind of hero of mine, a composer named Brian Reitzell. And he's a film composer. He's done many of Sofia Coppola's films, he did Lost in Translation, but he's done so many iconic films. And he's also a musician and a genius. And he, in our very first conversation, said, well, I had told him that the film was so much about alchemy and magic. And he brought up percussive instrumentation as in a way, a form of alchemy, because it's like you hit a metal thing against a wood thing, or a stone against another thing, and then it creates another sound, which is different than string instruments. And so he suggested that we really use percussion as the central voice of the score. And he referred me to look at Takemitsu, who actually composed many of my favorite Japanese films like Face of Another and Woman in the Dunes. Is like an extraordinary Japanese composer from the 50s and 60s. And so we used Takemitsu as our guide, and Brian composed the score all with real percussive instruments in his studio. So that's my response about the sound in the film.
That's fascinating. We have another question here. Before you actually start creating a film, how do you know, or maybe when do you know, that you've got a good idea? In other words, that it will make an impact on becoming human?
Well, I think I more know I have something when I want to just keep going deeper and deeper into it. And when I feel like it has potential to hold something that I feel is big enough in my life. I guess that's the simplest way to answer that. Like, I don't know, my number one feeling every day when I wake up in the morning, I would say outside of, whatever, my daily emotional life, is deep anxiety about global warming and environmental catastrophe. I mean, I feel it today. It's 60 degrees. It's beautiful. It's March 12th. Should it be that way? I don't know. There's like an unease that I feel. And so, I mean, many of my works, like a minute ago, the work that Tom mentioned, deal with that unease directly. But other works like this one, I'm looking at it maybe more historically. And so this is a long way to answer. I know that a subject matter that I want to work with is the right subject matter when I feel like it answers a somewhat banal, everyday feeling that I have already that's in the air. So, yeah.
I think it's also true that, Rachel takes quite a long time to research something as a journey. For example, Enclosure started with us talking about King Lear, and it went quite a long way from King Lear. And, when she's talking about making a film now, I know that Rachel's read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books in order to decide what the film would be. I've probably been speaking to her for 2 years about different novels. And so it's not always the starting point that's the end, but the starting points tend to be a bit of a guide star in some ways. And so for me, Rachel's work is the result of an incredible kind of polyphony of voices that she sort of walks her way through before she realizes this is the way the project will be.
Yeah, like with King Lear, I mean, we started with King Lear. The project started before Trump was elected, by the way. Obama was president when Tom and I first were talking about this. And so, Lear was kind of in the air because Trump was running. And then when I got into Lear, I got interested, Lear's actually about property division. That's what the whole story is about. What was happening in the landscape that had to do with property division then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then Lear kind of comes back a little bit in the sense that Jacko, our main character, you just saw briefly in that one clip, he's a Lear character. And so something can, seem like the central thing and then almost fully disappear and then come back in a little trickle.
We actually have a question about any other literary sources in addition to visual and artistic inspiration that you might take from. I don't know if you have anything else to say along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
We have another question here. It's a little longer, so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try to get through everything here. It says, how do you interact in your work with claims of truth? Documentary requires a commitment to almost singular truth. But as you mentioned, you've deviated from that medium quite a bit. Your mention of the level of research makes me curious about your work's relationship to history. Do you think that allows you to make deeper claims without being tied to a specific historical person or historical truth, speaking from the context of the present?
Well, these works are all fictions and they're all completely made up. And I mean, what's really cool about period films, I would say just period films in general, is that when you watch them, you're actually always watching the moment that they were made. Like if you see a Scorsese period film from the 80s, what you're really watching is how did he see the 80s in New York, even if it's not set in New York? Or they're just always so infused with the lens that they're viewing through. And sometimes it takes us to get older to see how clear that lens really was then. So I think of my relationship to historicity in the same way, that I'm fully aware that it's grounded in the present. For example, like the sky replacements, in 10 years, someone's going to say, wow, those look so 2019, or the orb, or how we do some of the music or the language of the actors. Long story short, like, why do I even bother being historical at all would be a bigger question if I know that it's just sitting in the present anyway. And I would say that because it allows the viewer and myself to in the transportation to another time, it allows us to open up and maybe think a bit more imaginatively, freely, openly. There's this thing that I always think back to in theater, the thing about the suspension of disbelief and that in the fourth wall, and that it's actually often easier for us to fall into something when the work feels that the thing we're watching feels flatter and less illustrative. And so because it creates a space where our brain can imagine half of it and meet the thing halfway. It's like why books are so fun to read, or because it's just words, we can bind into it. So I think a little bit about historical storytelling a bit like that. And in terms of the level of detail I'm applying or not, much of this film, it's quite bare bones. They're just tents in a landscape, or the historical accuracy is both defined and a bit abstract to allow for us to kind of enter into it.
One thing that occurred to me, Rachel, is the beauty in that clip you showed of the scenes of the wall building and how that encapsulated in one kind of extended visual image the whole sense of enclosure. I mean, I thought that was really nicely done.
Since you just mentioned books, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about your approach to the book form, another sort of time-based medium, and how your work and your research would take shape as an artist's book.
Oh, the artist book I'm working on right
Mhm.
now? Yeah, so it's the script, and then it's all of the notes and visual guides, images, on-set stuff, doodles that I was doing, all compiled page for page. So when you open the book, you can see everything. It's a format that I stole from Francis Ford Coppola that he did with The Godfather. You can actually buy, it's really cool to see. He cut out each page of the book, pasted it on a larger piece of paper, and then would bring it to set and draw and put all the stuff on it and annotate. And so I didn't do that on set, but I created my own derivative version of that. And then alongside that, the engravings that you saw.
So you mentioned earlier on a bit about how your practice has changed, originally from painting over to film. How else has your practice changed over time? And in particular, has it changed over this past year?
Over time or this past year, like almost opposite. Over time, it's gone from me doing everything myself to enclosure working with so many people, and it really being such a collaboration in that way. I would say like the underpinning guide for me in making any work is how can I learn more, both obviously about the subject matter, how to make a work, technically how to make more. And so for me, enclosure was like going to school in a way, because I got to learn so many new things from all the different department heads in their technique. So I would say that that's how my practice has changed, is in each work as it's scaled up differently, I get to learn more in different ways. And during lockdown, my practice definitely contracted because I was just at home and I was working on these drawings more intensely. So things that I could do with my hands, reading a lot. And it's when I actually began to, in April, so right after lockdown last year is when I started really getting into script writing. And that's really been the focus of what I've been doing recently.
I think we have time for one more question. And we have one here that asks about the young woman in the video clips. And if you could talk a bit more about her context in relation to the action of the film.
Yeah. So the setup is this: a group of grifters led by this guy, Jacko, who you see at the very end, who's an alchemist who tells the people, his followers, his grifters, we're doing all of this to go build a utopia in this place called St. Augustine. So we're going to hustle these people, predate them out of their land, because eventually we're going to get to the land of glory. And we need all these deeds so that we can exchange them all and buy our own piece of land. Recent, her backstory, we call them road babies in the film, but her backstory is that she was basically a lost refugee herself. Maybe she was in a family that got kicked off their land. She got dispersed from her family. It's not totally clear what her backstory is. And that when she was a kid, Jacko picked her up and trained her to be his actor, his excellent foil in their predation. Like he felt like, I can't go in and hustle people out of their land because I seem like a creepy old hustler, but you seem like innocent and young and safe and trustworthy, so you can do it. And in the final shot, he's a character in the film. There's this little kind of 8-year-old boy named Autumn, and you see her walk away with this little kid. And he's her sidekick in the film, who she's supposed to be teaching to become the next her in this group.
Okay. Thanks, Molly. And thank you, Rachel and Tom. It's been great to have you with us. We look forward to seeing Enclosure at the Armory in 2022. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you to our audience as well. And please join us for our next online program on Wednesday, March 31st at 12 p.m. with Marissa Angel Brown, Yale PhD 2014, Assistant Director for Programs at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage at Brown University, who will deliver a lecture on modern architecture in New Haven titled Model City. Thank you all.